Hello everyone, I'm Michaela Kathleen, and this is my May reading wrap-up. First, this month I finished Sylvie and Bruno from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Other Stories by Lewis Carroll. I finished this one this month, but I've been working on it for at least like 2 months now. I go really slow through these because I don't actually enjoy them that much. I got this book a lot of years ago from Barnes & Noble because I was interested in Alice in Wonderland. I do like the movie well enough, and it's a classic, of course. So I was curious, but also a lot of it was just because this book is so pretty. I mean, it shines, it's just beautiful. But I would feel very guilty if I had a book on my shelf that I had no intention of ever reading. So I have very, very slowly worked my way through it. It's sat on my TBR at various points for long stretches of time. I got through Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass quite some time ago, and then it sat on my shelf for quite some time. And now I have picked it back up and I finished Sylvie and Bruno, and I am now working my way through Sylvie and Bruno completed. After which I'll probably take another long break. But yeah, they're just very old and a little bit nonsensical, and I don't enjoy them all that much. But there was a chapter in Sylvie and Bruno that was kind of about the fairies and was a little more magical and more of a fun read with some fun details, like the fact that if you're ever walking by a lake with toads that are croaking and they stop, that means a fairy is passing by and they stop croaking out of respect. So I thought that was a fun, cute little detail. And so the chapter about fairies was fun and cute, but overall, not really my cup of tea. And after Sylvie and Bruno, I reread the entire Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. I wanted to reread these in preparation for The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the prequel book that just came out this month, which will be featured in my wrap-up next month. Which I will note that since I'm talking about all 3 books here, there will be lots of spoilers. So, starting with The Hunger Games. I love this series very much. I read it fairly early on in all the hype. It is probably my second favorite dystopian series that came out around this time that was like a government overthrow type series, my favorite being Uglies. But this one really is just so deep and has so much deeper meaning to it and has such important statements on society, and specifically our society right now, and how it's looking an awful lot like Greece right before Greece fell. But it also draws on like American history with how different people have been treated in our past, from people in mining towns to people who have tended our farms historically, and it's just got so much social commentary. But beyond that, it is also just a fast-paced, fun read. I also rewatched the movies. I don't know if I've ever been so organized with finishing a book, watching the movie that night, and watching and reading together before, so that was really fun. And I actually really love the movies. I feel like the movies get received pretty well compared to like some other adaptations, but some people still have pretty major problems with them. I really like the movies. It's one of those ones where the stuff that they add that's not in the books actually really adds to the story. I love getting to see behind the scenes of what the game makers are doing during the games, and I think some of that also adds its own really good social commentary, so I think that was just really well done. My one big complaint for the first movie would be that the mutations at the end of the book that look like dogs, in the movie they don't look like the fallen contestants like they do in the book, which just makes it so much creepier and more evil feeling. And then another thing that I always think about whenever I'm reading this first one is about the first time I read it. I don't do that with a lot of books, but I do it with this one because I remember so vividly thinking the first time that I read it that Rue would somehow survive the games, and I was just so shocked when the book went there with killing her off, even though like it was obviously like an established thing that was going to happen. There could only be one victor, but still I had somehow convinced myself that she would make it. And her death scene is just so sad. And yeah, so that's another thing about these books, is that they're so sad, so emotional, and it just really makes you feel a lot of empathy for these characters. So yeah, those were some of my thoughts on this reread of the first Hunger Games. Next, I of course read Catching Fire, which I like pretty equally to the first book. In the first book, I of course really loved Rue, and I really loved the world building and getting to know the world. I'm a pretty big sucker for world building, especially with dystopians. And I think I liked the build-up in the first book better, like the interviews and the training sessions and everything that built up to the arena I enjoyed better than this book, probably because she stayed in District 12 for so long at the beginning of this book. It took a really long time to get to the arena in this one. But in this one, I really loved the quarter quail twist, and when Peeta painted Rue's portrait in the training session, and of course the arena itself. Tick-tock, this is a clock. And then in the first book, I felt like the ending maybe dragged just a tiny bit, and then this book, the ending felt kind of abrupt, so kind of even but opposite there. But yeah, all through my reread on this one, I just couldn't help but think about a quote from Harry Potter that I know well. It is a Dumbledore quote. Voldemort himself created his own worst enemy, just as tyrants everywhere do. Have you any idea how much tyrants fear the people they oppress? And yeah, I just had that quote kind of in my head throughout the entire reread of this one this time, because I feel like this book takes that quote to such a literal place, even though obviously they're not connected, it's Harry Potter and the Hunger Games. But the quote is just very well represented by this book in the fact that Snow very literally created his own worst enemies in the victors of the games. So again, I definitely just totally enjoyed this reread of the Hunger Games, and was trying to think about it a little more critically than maybe I have in the past, which made it even more enjoyable. And then finally we had Mockingjay. This of course is generally the least liked book in the Hunger Games trilogy. I remembered feeling a lot more bored by it and disliking it more than I actually did upon this reread. It wasn't as boring as I remembered, which I think that was my main problem with it on the first read, was it felt kind of slow and boring, like all the war stuff, especially when Katniss actually gets into the field. It felt like it should have been more exciting, but it wasn't. But upon this reread, I did enjoy it more, and I have never been as upset about the ending as I know some people are. Some people really dislike Katniss ending up with Peeta, which I had never had a problem with. I don't feel like she just went along with it and just sort of ended up with him. Like, I feel like it was pretty well built up. And I think it really, the whole point of it is to offer hope. This is a pretty dark series with a lot of really bad stuff that's very depressing, and so I think it gets the point across that, like, this is how things could go, this is how bad things could end up. But then I think it's important that in the end it also showed, like, but we could come back from that, you know? So I was always totally fine with Katniss ending up with Peeta. And then I know at the beginning some people didn't like Katniss's breakdown, like they felt like she was a different character, but I think her breakdown is really understandable. And I actually was kind of more, I guess, confused by Finnick's breakdown at the beginning of the book, because when we see him at the end of the second book, he's plotting and planning with Plutarch and Haymitch and seems totally fine. And then at the beginning of this book, he's arguably worse off than Katniss mentally. And so it just sort of is jarring and is like, well, how did he end up here when last we saw him? He seemed to be doing just fine. Like, I understand that the explanation that he's worried about Annie, and that unlike Katniss, he has realized that the Capitol is torturing her specifically to torture him, but it still just feels somewhat out of the blue. And then, of course, we come to the other thing about Finnick that some people didn't enjoy. This is extremely spoilery, so if you don't want to know any more about Finnick's storyline in the third book, maybe turn away now. And that is Finnick's death. I feel like Finnick's death was there in an attempt to be very realistic. The stakes are extremely high. They're in this terrible situation running from these extremely deadly and also very fast creatures. And I feel like Finnick's death was like, well, we have to kill people, and if we just kill the nobodies, then that's not realistic. And also, this is gonna raise the stakes even more, which is all fine, but there's no emotional part to Finnick's death. And Finnick is a pretty big character that people love a lot, and so there needed to be more emotion for his death. So I think that's why it didn't play well. And it happens so fast that you almost don't even realize it. It's like 2 sentences long, and you go back and you say, what has happened here? And then Finnick is only mentioned 2 times after that, both in basically in passing. One when Annie says that she would like to vote for Finnick on whether or not there are another Hunger Games, and 2 when it is mentioned in passing that Annie has had a baby, which of course Finnick is not mentioned in that sentence. Only Annie is, but you just as the audience member then can think, oh, that would be Finnick's baby. So definitely not enough time spent for our poor Finnick. So yeah, definitely my least favorite in the series, but for me, still a good book, still satisfying. I have switched back and forth on Goodreads. The first 2 books are 5 stars solidly, no question. And then this one I have switched back and forth between 4 and 5 stars several times. But yeah, definitely the series as a whole is just one of my favorites, a super important series with a lot of thought on the messaging put into it, and an important read that I think anyone should take the time for. And I am, of course, definitely excited to read the prequel next month. President Snow would probably not be my first choice for a character to learn more about, but I will take what I can get. And also, I trust Suzanne Collins based on these 3 books, and so I'm going into it with an open mind, and I'm trying not to read reviews until that time. So these were all the books that I read in May. A very enjoyable Hunger Games reread and a continued slog through Alice in Wonderland. Let me know down below what you've been reading this month, if you've done a Hunger Games reread for the prequel, and please no spoilers for the prequel itself. Thanks for watching. Remember, words matter.